I'm the director of the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law. I'm also professor in the, by courtesy in the Political Science Department and a senior fellow here at the Freeman Spogli Institute and senior fellow at Hoover by courtesy. It's my pleasure on behalf of the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law and CREASE, the Center for Russia, East European and Eurasian Studies, to welcome my friend Andy Kuchins here today to talk to us about his experience with the government of Kyrgyzstan. Let's put it that that way. His odd experience. Andy is actually no stranger to Stanford and to CSAC in particular, where we are. This conference room, of course, belongs to CSAC. He was at one point the associate director here. When was that? Like
1997 to 2000.
Right. Okay. So that may actually be when I met you. It could be that long ago, Andy. We're getting old, as it turns out. Not you. Not yes, exactly. But still fighting. Andy has a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He has really been not only just a leader here at Stanford in that period, but also in the 90s, but also you were at Berkeley too.
Yes.
Yes.
Berkeley Stanford program.
Yes, exactly. Ran the Berkeley Stanford program, which actually some of us very much lament here. We don't have, I was saying to Mike yesterday, we don't have enough interaction with our colleagues at Stanford. So if you're out there, Steve Fish, listen up.
Who was at Stanford as a graduate student
exactly.
in the Berkeley Stanford program at that time.
Yeah, exactly. But it's very hard, you know, for some reason getting over the bay.
Traffic.
Yeah, exactly. Getting up there. It's so hard. It's so hard. Andy, aside from making a mark here at Stanford and also then at Berkeley, has moved to Washington after that. In the 2000s, you pretty much worked everywhere. You worked at the Carnegie, the Carnegie Endowment, at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. You've taught at Georgetown and Johns Hopkins. And in February 2019, he was appointed president of the American University of Central Asia. He's going to tell you his story because you'll notice it's 2021, and he's the former president of the American University of Central Asia, which is in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. So Andy, thank you so much for coming and sharing this with us. So we're on Zoom, and I guess Andy speaks, and then you're going to guide us through Zoom questions, and I'll help moderate those and the live questions.
Cool.
Andy.
Well, first, Catherine, thank you very much for such a generous invitation. And thanks to the Center for Democracy Development and Rule of Law and the Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies for co-hosting this meeting today. It's a great pleasure, of course, to be back at Stanford. I also grew up in the Bay Area.
Oh, yeah.
And in fact, my godfather, Larry Harris, was the Yell leader for Stanford back in 1933. But all of my siblings went to the University of California. And one of them, my sister Ann, here today, is kind of representing the family. And I just want to note that because they were so supportive during this really difficult period of time for my wife, Lilia, who is here also. And especially to Lilia, express my thanks and gratitude for effectively saving me. I don't know what I would have done, but I might have gone crazy, frankly. It was a brutal experience. So about the title, maybe it's a better title for a Vanity Fair article about this, Fear and Loathing in Kyrgyzstan, an American story. I'm always a big fan of Hunter S. Thompson. Wrote Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail when I was in high school and college. Gonzo journalism. My 27 months in Kyrgyzstan, in Bishkek, was pretty much of a gonzo experience from start to finish, not just from the moment the Ministry of the Interior so rudely entered our lives on April 23rd this year. But I really don't want to focus too much of this presentation on me. Now beware, whenever someone says, I don't want to make it all about me, it's probably going to be all about me. I really am trying to put it in a broader context, and particularly thinking about U.S. foreign policy goals in the region and democracy promotion, Catherine's expertise, among others. Overall, the experience was driven by external factors related to Kyrgyz domestic affairs and the global environment, But the details of what happened to me are perhaps more tied to intra-AUCA conflict and poor governance of the university, which I saw as part of my mission coming out there was to address and to improve. So first, a bit about AUCA. It was founded in 1994 as initially the Kyrgyzsko-Amerikansky Fakultet, the Kyrgyz American faculty. It was part of Kyrgyz National University, and it was founded by a few professors from Kyrgyz National University who'd gone to the United States on Fulbright programs, and they came back with the crazy idea of establishing an American-style liberal arts university in Kyrgyzstan. This is a good plug for the Fulbright program and exchanges in general, of course, which I'm a big supporter of. A few years later, it went independent, became known as the American University of Kyrgyzstan. And then in 2001, 2002, it changed its name to the American University of Central Asia to reflect a broadening scope in its recruiting of students, as well as the research that was being done there. Until 2015, it was housed in the former Communist Party of the Soviet Union building in downtown Kyrgyzstan. There were big busts of Marx and Lenin on the walls there. It's kind of ironic. But then in 2015, it moved to its new campus. It's a strikingly modern and really uniquely designed building on the south edge of Bishkek. And the building and the campus really accentuate the values of transparency and openness that are hallmarks of the AUCA ethos. It was designed by noted New York architect Henry Meyerberg, and it's won a number of prizes as a vision model for modern university building architecture. It's really extraordinary. So it's an American-style liberal arts educational institution, and in 2010, this was greatly strengthened through a partnership with Bard College in New York. And Bard's faculty and administration have contributed greatly to improving the curriculum and faculty development. And it's a real comparative strength of AUCA that not only does it award Kyrgyz degrees, but it also Bard College degrees. And the AUCA tuition is about $7,000 a year, and Bard College tuition about $75,000 a year. I would advertise this is one of the greatest bargains in global higher education. At any rate, AUCA is completely unique for Kyrgyzstan. Not only for Kyrgyzstan, but for all of Central Asia. And in fact, it could not exist in any other country in Central Asia besides Kyrgyzstan, because of Kyrgyzstan being relatively more open and plural. So historically and to this day, the US State Department and the Open Society Foundation have been the largest external funders of AUCA. There are other, and that's about 50% of its funding. It's important to know. The other 50% of its funding, more or less, comes from tuition revenue. There are other small revenue flows, but it's fair to say that a consistent struggle for the institution has been to broaden the base of its sources of revenue. And in my view, and over time, it's going to be the alumni of AUCA who will need to really step up as a source of revenue, as it is for most U.S. colleges and universities for long-term sustainability of the institution. They need to own it in a way. But there is no tradition for this sort of philanthropy in the region, but I am proud that in the 2 years as president, we had by far and away the two most successful fundraising drives with alums. There are now about 4,500 alums of AUCA. About 2/3 are in Kyrgyzstan, and the other third all over the world. So I think this goal is reachable, but it requires a lot of effort over time, consistent effort over time. It's not easy. So AUCA is by far the most diverse student body in Central Asia, with Kyrgyz being about 65% of the student body. Afghans are about 10% of the student body. They are supported by the US Department of State from a mandate from the US Congress to support education, higher education for women in general. And so about 80% of our Afghans are women, and about 20% men. And I can tell you that this is some of the most effective US tax dollars spent in this program. It's a fabulous program. And probably the population of Afghan students this year at AUCA is relatively larger given what's happened with the takeover by the Taliban, the closing down of the American University of Afghanistan, uh, and the barring of women from studying in universities that's taken place there. Though there's a significant Tajik population, also close to 10%, but there was a border conflict between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan this year, so that could be down. Then about 5% or so from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and the last 5 or 10% coming from around the world. Now, one of my initiatives was to expand recruiting beyond Central Asia, nearby countries, in a strategic way. We were starting with Nepal, India, and China, but this, like many things, was curtailed by COVID. I do believe this will be important for a revenue flow and also for raising the standards of the student body, but this is also a long-term project and not easy to execute. So I don't have the numbers for this year, but there are about 1,100, 1,200 undergraduates, 125, 150 MA students, about 100 students are in a postgraduate program, postgraduate from high school called the New Generation Academy. And in 2019, AUCA founded what's called the Technical School of Innovation. It's kind of like an early college. Kids do effectively 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. High school ends at 11th grade in Kyrgyzstan. And by the time they graduate, they would have received significant enough college credits that could be taken to AUCA or actually anywhere, as the program is affiliated with the University of Geneva. So that's the student body. Quickly about Kyrgyzstan. It's a small, poor country in Central Asia, bordering China, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. And like all most post-Soviet states, it's celebrating, of course, its 30th year of independence this year. Per capita GDP is about $2,000. Not many countries with per capita GDPs that small are, let's say, Wilsonian democracies. The population is about 6 million, but about 1 million of those work as guest workers in Russia, mostly. It's a secular Islamic state. The Islamic influence is growing, especially in rural areas. And again, it's the most open and plural, while it's the most open and plural polity in Central Asia, and AUCA could not exist in another Central Asia state. The political Kyrgyzstan itself is endemically corrupt, deeply, deeply corrupt. So a little history, geopolitics. I'd like to start this with many of my talks for public groups, kind of give a sense of how the Kyrgyz mentality of where they are in the world. So for more than 2,000 years, Kyrgyz and other Central Asian states, groups, tribes, peoples have been dealing with the ebbs and flows of Chinese imperial expansion. Actually, the Chinese historically reached their furthest point west in the 8th century when they were defeated in what is now the town of Talas, which is in Kyrgyzstan, by Kyrgyz tribes and Arabs as well. 170 years ago, Russia entered the picture. And Russia, both Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, are responsible. I mean, they colonized the area, but they are also responsible for most of the modernization of the area. And the Kyrgyz perspective on the Russians is, while it's kind of ambivalent, but it's definitely a lot more positive than it is towards the Chinese. I'd say the third most influential country there now is Turkey. Kyrgyz is a Turkic language. And especially with the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan, which is lowering the influence of the United States overall in the region, I think this puts Turkey in a relatively stronger position. So the US, has been engaged really only for the 30 years of independence. Now, our influence, though, is larger mainly because of what the idea of the United States is, what we represent. And I would reference a new book, very good book by Ed Schatz, Slow Anti-Americanism, Social Movements and Symbolic Politics in Central Asia, in which he outlines this thesis. Um, so before I went to Kyrgyzstan in 2019, I was given some survey research that was done by INR at the State Department, and it was classified at the time, but it's no longer classified. Now you have to be a little skeptical at any kind of survey research done in relatively autocratic societies, but the results are interesting, and I think they mean something. They were looking at the influence of Russia, China, and the U.S., or actually the perception of Kyrgyz towards those three countries. So Kyrgyzstan is pretty China-phobic. China is the largest economic actor by far. And the perception of China was about 26%, 25% positive. The perception of the United States was also about 25, 26%, along with China. What was a little surprising to me was that the perception of Russia was like 96, 97% positive, and the perception of Putin. So why is that so? Well, one factor I think is that Kyrgyzstan is certainly more fearful of Chinese expansion and sees that China is a greater threat to their sovereignty over time. And then there's the long-standing linguistic, cultural, historical, political, and strategic ties with Russia. And so Russia is kind of a hedge with China, and I think that drives some of that view. I am very skeptical, though, about the prospect for deep Sino-Russian conflict over Central Asia, which some seem to believe in Washington. Why? Well, because for both countries, this is really a tertiary at best interest. You know, for China, it's the South China Sea looking out east, and then they would look down to Southeast Asia. And then, because of their deep concern, obsession with Muslim groups, mainly Uyghurs, but not only, in Xinjiang province, that does raise their concern about what's happening next door in Central Asia. And for Russia, obviously, their first concerns are west, with Europe and the United States. Then they would look to the greater Middle East, and then to Central Asia. So I think that, and there's kind of a division of labor, and that the Russians are much more responsible for security, intelligence, political influence, and China is mainly in the economic game. And so far that holds. I think if there were to be some conflict, it may come at the time when the Chinese would not be confident that the Russians are able to manage political stability in the region. And we've seen, so, but we'll just leave that as it is. So why did I accept this job? Well, certainly it was not something I ever imagined doing or dreamed of doing. It was a product of complete serendipity. As you're going to find out in your lives, some of the best things, some of the worst things in your life are going to happen because of serendipity. And I'd spent 15 years in think tanks in DC. And in 2015, I decided to move back to academia, and I took a position as a research professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Services, Catherine said. I had done a lot of work for the previous decade in Afghanistan and Central Asia. And I particularly visited the region a lot in 2014, 2015. I visited in Turkmenistan 4 times in 1 year. That's got to be an all-time record. It's a pretty bizarre place. So I spent a lot of time in Central Asia in 2014, 2015. And so I was familiar with the place, but the job prospect came up over a dinner conversation with the then Kyrgyz ambassador, AUCA alum and friend Kadir Taktagulov. just before Christmas in 2018. And I kind of came up late in the discussion, and he mentioned that the position at AUCA was open. And I said, "Oh yeah, I know a bit about AUCA, and I know Andrew Wachtell, their president, or previous president." And he responded, "Andy, you would be a great president." So, well, that's okay, Kadir. I won't categorically reject thinking about this, but actually, after a short period of time, I decided I really wanted to do this. Why did I really want to do it? Well, I kind of joked that it was a good time for Russia Eurasia expert to leave Washington. U.S.-Russia relations had been, well, they are what they are, and they had been for a while. I was not enthralled with the obviously with the Trump administration, and so I felt I needed a new challenge. And at age six, I was going to be 60 in February, and so the idea of you start to think more about your personal legacy of your life, and I felt I could make a more durable, concrete, in some respects, measurable changes to an important institution in a part of the world that I cared about, and that was attractive. In some, I thought that I could make more of a difference in Bishkek than I could in Washington. Uh, the AUCA was very excited about my interest, and in February we closed the deal. I was really excited about this new challenge. Lilia was maybe not quite so thrilled about this. She is a Muscovite, and I remember when we first visited Bishkek in January 2019. She said, "God, it looks so Soviet." But it's kind of a dreary and far off province. So early impressions of the university, kind of before and after taking the position. One, there was a tremendous elan, esprit de corps amongst the student body. There's a great energy about the place. Literally, the place rocked. Um, a tremendous performing arts group. Much of this was due to one remarkable guy, Nikolai Grigorovich Shulgin, who managed the student life office for about 25 years, a former professional football player, soccer player. Um, Students would like professional singers and dancers would come to AUCA because of this, and so that there's this energy about it. Um, the But to contrast that, the faculty had been pretty much systemically beaten down for years by the previous administration, and uh, and the nearly 18-month interregnum between presidents. They were poorly paid. They were really manipulated by the administration. The morale was really low. There had been no faculty meeting in 2 years, and I knew the restoring.
That can be a good thing.
Well, it can be a good thing. Yes, beware of what you wish for. But uh, I knew that trying to restore their morale would be a big challenge. And I had a sense that there had been a recent history of very poor governance and mismanagement of the university. And a lot of focus in the first part of the 2010s was getting this new building project done. It was a great result. It opened in 2020 and the fall of 2015. But my sense was the institution began to lose its mojo. There were, for me, a lot of John McEnroe moments of "you can't be serious" when I heard about something that had happened or some decision, or I would say, like, who thought that was a good idea? There were a lot of moments like this. For example, the highest academic position in the university, the vice president for academic affairs, was eliminated in 2014. So there was no senior academic administration figure. This was very damaging for the university. Um, and there's also an implementation of what seemed to be a very flawed new organizational framework of departments and divisions. That was really kind of a mess. There had been too much focus on two projects to develop increased flows of students to AUCA, one a high school on the AUCA premises, another the Technical School of Innovation. I mean, they opened in 2016 and 2019, but they were conceived about the same time. So there was a lot of energy that went to that. And this was really, I felt, at the expense of the university itself and the interests of the university itself. There's just limited bandwidth that the board has and a relatively small administration has at this university. Three, there was this absurd organization chart. Um, signed off by the interim president before I arrived, which gave virtually everybody reported to this VP COO, who in principle was to report to me. But in my first meeting with him, I remember in April of 2019, before I became president, he was the one that showed me the org chart. I looked at it, and I'm thinking to myself, "Whoa, this is messed up." And then he told me that he reports to the board. And I said, "Wait a second here, but look, the org chart says you report to the president." And he said, "Well, no, I report to the board on a number of things." It was not a it was not it was a pretty strained conversation. And at one point I simply said, "Look, you know, nothing personal, but I'm not coming out here to be co-president with you or anybody else. That's not the program." But that was an indicator of problems to come. Um, you know, Another indication of this, I remember a meeting with one of the most authoritative, I'd say, local board member dinner. His direct quote about this VP COO was, "He's a crook and you need to get rid of him as soon as possible." Wow. Well, even I was surprised by that. I did want to actually remove him from the university and wanted to fire him because he was an obstruction to virtually everything that I was trying to do. The human relations department was manipulated for his personal interests. He actually there was a presidential uh, VP COO for president campaign that was run out of the human resources department, in which they were using carrots and sticks like salary to get their support. Okay, I don't think that happens at Stanford. Um, the PR department was totally dysfunctional. Similar story. I mean, the promotion of the interests of the VP COO were put ahead of the university. They were pretty incompetent. I mean, I arrived. They hadn't had a sitting president for a year and a half, and public relations department didn't. There was nothing. There was no mention. There was nothing about it. They did nothing. And I also arrived at the time of graduation. Graduation is the most significant event of the year especially for AUCA, and for many colleges, it's a big event. And we had a great speaker, the author of Forever Wars, and it was great. It was a great event, and PR didn't report on it for like a month. And after 10 days, I wrote to them on email, "Hey, aren't you going to report about graduation?" Week passes, and they hadn't done it. I was really unhappy, and I knew that was a big problem. I mean, the director of the public relations department didn't speak English, like at AUCA, where English is the dominant language, etc. It's had serious judgment issues. They were operating on a very outdated charter from 2007, despite the board approval of a new one in 2013 that was never submitted to the Ministry of Justice for reasons unknown to me. There was a really outdated administrative system that operated as if computers and electronic communications almost did not exist. So it was extremely inefficient. And a quite weak board of directors, frankly. Their attention to governance had clearly diminished in the 5 years or so before I arrived. And this showed in many ways. And the the local board members, especially, well, you look for three things in board members. You look for wealth, three W's: wealth or access to wealth. Since fundraising is such a big part of any university's existence, and especially the role of a president, you look for wisdom. Wisdom. They can actually help you think through problems. They have knowledge of higher education and research and the mission of a university. None of them had experience like that. Most of them were graduates of AUCA, and thus relatively young, around 40 or so. And the last is work, and will actually do work with the president, with the administration, with the faculty on various issues that come up. One of the U.S. board members said, "Well, The local members are a work in progress. Well, basically, I saw no work and I saw no progress. And relations with the board were very tough. I'll say a little bit more about that. But let's turn to the external environment in which the university operated during my 2-year tenure, because it was uh, dynamic. Um, so we were an explicitly American project and a successful one as the top university in the country by a large margin. We were like Harvard, Stanford, and Amherst together. That's where I went. So these are not randomly chosen institutions. Um, and uh, and I had experience, um, I had experience running a very high-profile U.S. think tank in Moscow, as Mike knows, the Carnegie Moscow Center, and I knew what it was like to be attacked uh, for being an American institution, and particularly whenever U.S.-Russian ties were low. It was almost like they're going down, then we're more attacked, almost a direct correlation. Anyway, so I knew how to take a punch. So U.S. Kyrgyz relations were strained. They had been strained for a while. The Kyrgyz threw us out of their air base, military base, Manas, in 2014. That was very critical for getting our troops in and out of Afghanistan. Uh, there was a big flap the next year over diplomatic immunity of U.S. AID workers. There was arrest of Peace Corps officials. A number of incidents that were straining the U.S. Kyrgyz relationship. Probably the larger issue, though, is that as a country so dependent on Russia, and as U.S.-Russia relations uh, collapsed, this did not help at all. And Kyrgyzstan is not a fully sovereign country. And this is especially true with its intelligence services, the GNKB, Государственный комитет национальной безопасности, which essentially was a subsidiary of the Russian FSB, especially when it came to matters involving any technical means, any technology. That was FSB. So some of these how AUCA was kind of vulnerable or attacked. Let me just elucidate a few. So it first manifested as AUCA was called out for being a haven for the LGBT community, which in fact we are or were, with the March 2019 International Women's Day LGBT parade. But it was greatly exaggerated in the press the extent to which AUCA students and faculty were taking part. In December of 2019, corruption issues exploded in the country. The investigation of the largest crime boss, Raim Matraimov, colloquially known as Raim Million. He was exposed in investigations by US supported media outlets, Klop and Azatik, for basically stealing $700 million when he was the deputy head of customs, and basically managing the trade, illicit trade from China through Kyrgyzstan to Uzbekistan. And then there was a demonstration demonstration in early December. The press reports on it there were about 1,000 people there. Supposedly, 400 of them were AUCA students and faculty. That kind of thing. So then comes the pandemic. The pandemic exposed the incompetence of the sitting president, Jane Beckhoff, and his administration. They were really hard hit in the summer of 2020. It was a disaster. I should note that Lily and I also got stranded outside of the country for 5+ months, from March of 2019 until August of 2019. I can explain that story later if you want, but it's important for the narrative. There was a sense of growing political instability, and the parliamentary elections were scheduled for October 4th, 2020, a little more than a year ago. So we arrived back on August 19th, and a couple of days later, I got from our ambassador, Ambassador Donald Liu, great guy. He's now the Assistant Secretary for Central and South Asia. Hey, Andy, welcome back. And it looks like they're expecting you. You should check out these videos. So these videos were at the start of the parliamentary campaign. The first video was that basically, the story was that the State Department has called back Andrew Kuchins early from his vacation so that he can help implement the Amerikansky plan, the American plan to support three opposition parties. Blah, 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 blah. There was actually not one fact that was correct, except for the fact that they got the date that I arrived back in Bishkek right. It was very slickly done. But the Russian speaker was not able to pronounce correctly Kyrgyz names and places. So it was an obvious tell that this was, FSB, Russian intelligence behind this effort. There were a whole series of these that went through the fall, and they got worse and worse. And that was pretty tough. So then we get to the election itself, October 4th. So none of the three opposition parties that, of course, that I and the ambassador were working so hard to put in power actually made the 7% bar to get representation into the parliament. And it was that result which brought people out in the streets the next day. It's kind of funny. I was having lunch downtown with one of our staff and a candidate we wanted to bring onto the board, and it was the revolution was literally starting 1 block away. And I remember Burmet telling me, "Well, Andy, you can't be a president of the American University of Central Asia and not be involved, not have a revolution happen." But let me just be explicit: these are not revolutions; these are coups d'états. Okay, the revolution. We have the world's foremost experts in the room on revolutions. In a revolution, there is systemic change. There is no systemic change in these coups d'états. It was just the change at the person at the top, and who was going to be stealing and extorting money from the others changes. That's it. There was a very surprising leader that emerged, Sadir Japarov, who is now the president. On July 6th, there was an amnesty of some prisoners. One of them was the former president Atanbayev. One of them was the former prime minister Babanov. And this Sadir Japarov was one of them. He'd actually been in jail for the previous 3 or 4 years. Before that, he'd been a fugitive in Kazakhstan because he had tried to kidnap a parliamentarian 7 or 8 years ago in his efforts to expose the stealing that was taking place at the Kumtor gold mine company, probably the largest source of foreign revenue in the country. At any rate, I would say that the odds in Vegas on that guy emerging as the next president were very long. I wish I'd made that bet. What happened, it was quite extraordinary. From a period of 9 days, from July 6th to July 15th, this guy which kind of came from nowhere, he was the acting president and the prime minister. Now, it is definitely clear that this was not what Mr. Putin and Russia wanted to see happen. Mr. Putin does not like to see elected leaders that he can work with in his sphere of influence to be thrown out of power by societal opposition. Or really, it was, this is like the Bolshevik Revolution when Lenin said, "Power is lying in the streets." And Japarov and his people simply they were more organized, they were a bit more militarized, but his real secret was, this is why the Bishkek political elite, who are primarily Russian-speaking, Russian reading on social media, didn't see this coming, was his use of Kyrgyz language social media. There was a great article in Open Democracy by a couple of young women Kyrgyz social scientists in Germany about this, and it's the most very, very informative. So anyway, he was the guy that became president. Despite this, 2021 starts relatively quiet. Japarov is elected president, but the economy was very hard hit. A 10% GDP drop. There's underlying nervousness about COVID, the economy, and political stability. Now, before I get to the final denouement of this sorry tale, it's mostly a sad story. Um, Let me, especially given the challenges of dealing with a number two who seemingly saw his role as obstructing every effort of mine to improve the governance of the university, I found myself receiving little or no support from the board. And this was always surprising to me. I found myself in the awkward position of pointing out and trying to fix many things that they seemed to not really care about, or they didn't like to have things pointed out that were problems that had taken place on their watch while they were exercising oversight of the university. You know, I mean, many faculties, many allies in the faculty, the administration, and the student body, but being sandwiched between an intransigent, in my view, corrupted VPCOO and a fairly inert board, I felt like Sisyphus dragging the rock up the mountain. And at times, it almost felt like a battle between good and evil, frankly. Um, uh, Especially in the last couple of months that I was there. Um, Now, to cut the board some slack, we have to remember that no American board member was able to visit AUCA in Kyrgyzstan, or they did visit between late February of 2020, and in fact, just until recently, one did, the one who's been named as the interim president since I resigned. Um, so it's really hard to know what's going on if you're not there on a more regular basis. Now, if you had local board members who were actually more engaged, more thoughtful, I mean, they could be more useful as sources of information about what's really happening in the university and the country. But that was a shortcoming. And since Bishkek seems to really thrive on rumors, often with little or no basis in fact, it was more than likely that the local information provided to U.S. board members, I think, was very dubious. That was a problem. Um, all right, I have a list of what I think are my accomplishments, but in the in the interest of time, I will skip over that. If someone wants to know, I'll be happy to elucidate them for you. But there were, I mean, despite the difficulties, there were a number of things that I and my colleagues were able to do that were definitely positive for the university. The university ranking had fallen for 5 consecutive years. Now, university rankings, it's kind of a controversial topic, and they don't mean everything, but they do mean something. And they're certainly important for the PR. And when I got there, I just decided, okay, I'm going to find out why our ranking has fallen, and I'm going to reverse that. And last year, our ranking from number 163 in East Virgin Europe and Central Asia in the QS survey, which is the only rating service that includes Central Asia, we climbed from 163 to 138, 25 spots in 1 year. That was pretty good. That was a pretty good trick. But um, so let me get to the sad and premature ending of my tenure. At the outset, uh, if the final ordeal was simply a matter of state harassment, anti-Americanism, it would have been a hell of a lot easier for me to take personally. Um, but unfortunately, I'm almost certain this was not the case. And to me, there was kind of a perfect storm of events contributing to my detention, trial, and deportation. But what I really want to emphasize about this, and this is a big takeaway, I think, is that when American institutions abroad do not live up to or adequately put into practice the values they purport to promote, good governance, transparency, rule of law, all key tenets of democracy promotion, you really put the whole project and sometimes the safety of individuals at risk. AUCA is an institution that failed to adequately protect me, their president. This was a big failure, but on that, my conclusion is this was more of an own goal, as football fans or soccer fans would say. Don't get me wrong, I've walked you briefly through some of the external factors that created the environment that facilitated something like this to happen. The pandemic is number one. No pandemic, then Lily and I are not outside of the country for 5 months, and I'm in a stronger position than to assert my authority, build my authority with administration and even with local board members. No pandemic. Also, I'm very dubious there would have been a coup or revolution in 2020. 2020 was a pretty hard year for incumbent politicians. Um, Likely no pandemic. We may still have Donald Trump as president, for example. Um, but there would have been a lot less economic and political instability in the country. So that's a really kind of important thing in the background. So what really happened? Um, so to this day, and probably forever, I cannot be fully sure. And I certainly have no intention to go on a crusade to find out. That was a brutal episode for both Lily and myself, and for the good of my sanity and our marriage, got to move on. I have not talked about this in public in the more than 7 months since this happened. This is the first time. Um, and I leave out a lot of the gory details, but I still do want to kind of correct the record as the press reporting was. None of it has been fully accurate about what happened, despite some of it actually being open source material. So what was the catalyst? It was a package of prescription medication held up at customs for me that we learned about in early March. As I had received two packages in the mail, through the mail in the past, this was kind of surprising. Um, and But since the VP COO is responsible for dealings with government offices and officials, I informed him of it, and he said he would take care of it. I would check about once a week to inquire about the status, and he essentially replied he was working on it. I have two text messages from him still on my phone, March 26th and April 6th. So what's happening with the package? He says, I'm working on it. April 6th, communication with him went dead. And I actually kind of forgot about it myself, frankly. So while my work relationship with the VPCO had always been rocky, and I had considered firing him in October 2019, I was grateful and valued highly his efforts and those of others in pulling AUCA through COVID. If I talked about our achievements, I mean, we came through COVID with flying colors, pandemic. And the two key indicators are that our incoming freshman class was higher than usual, and our retention rate of upperclassmen was higher than usual also. We outperformed our best case scenarios by a lot. And that was an all hands on deck effort. Leadership matters, but the board played an important role. The VP COO, VPAA, and all the administration, all the faculty, and the students as well. So I was, but with the new year, my concerns about his behavior were growing, and especially in those last 2 months, March and April. I'd planned a trip to New York leaving April 24th to meet with key U.S. board members to convey the message that for a variety of reasons, I could no longer work with the VP COO on a day-to-day administration of the university. But I didn't want to totally fire him. I wanted him to only be responsible for our new project, the Technical School of Innovation, which really he's the author of, this early college. And I also viewed his role at TSI and AUCA simultaneously as a major conflict of interest, especially because he had some murky financial interest in TSI, or so it seemed. Now, the only three people that were aware of this prescription medication package were Lily and myself and the VP COO. And very few people were aware of my trip to New York, and virtually no one knew my purpose, with the exception of myself. On April 23rd, at about 1 p.m., two officials from the Ministry of the Interior appeared at AUCA. I was working at home that Friday, and they met my assistant, and they came with the documents that I was being called in for questioning, and that Lilia also, as she's a witness, and needed to appear at the Ministry of the Interior headquarters at 5 p.m. that day. Now it's a common trick, well, not a trick, but practice on their part to call in people on a Friday afternoon because then they can detain them 48 hours and put them in front of a judge on Monday and kind of expedite the whole thing. And I was very fortunate they didn't actually put me in jail after that, after the questioning, but it was very close. Um, Lily and I had no idea what this was about, no idea. But I decided to follow the sound advice of our ambassador, Donald Liu, to show up and find out. Trying to leave the country anyway the next day was likely not possible, and it would have been a very bad look if I was caught. And certainly I would never be allowed back, but probably I would not be allowed out, and I would definitely have been put in prison. So we went to find out. So we found out that I was being detained for receiving, quote, unquote, psychotropic substances with the intention to produce and distribute narcotics. Psychotropic substances with the intention to produce and distribute narcotics. To put it mildly, we were stunned. And it was reported widely in the press that I was a narco baron. Of course, that someone had released this information to the press. I guess. So it was like I was El Chapo or Walter White in Breaking Bad. My son jokes with me. I cut my hair so short. He said, "Dad, you look like Walter White now." Or I was reminded of the 1979 film Midnight Express, where an young American is finds himself in jail on trumped up drug charges in a Turkish prison, and it's not very nice. So to put it mildly, it was not a good feeling. It was really like a nuclear bomb had gone off in our lives. And as the MVD characterized the charges, I faced the possibility of 12 plus years in a Kyrgyz jail. 12 plus years in a Kyrgyz jail. This was prescription medication I've been taking for 16 years for ADHD and anxiety. It's extremely common in the United States. Before leaving for Kyrgyzstan, I found an announcement on the Kyrgyz embassy site in Washington, the message that guests to the Kyrgyz Republic could bring any medication prescribed by a doctor. So I'd actually done a little bit of research about this before. This is really a larger problem, by the way, for people that travel with medication. I've heard of a couple of stories of people going into Russia recently just because they contact me because of this, and like what to do. Well, if you're a Russian citizen and you get caught doing this, well, you're screwed. At any rate, so the question is of the VPCO role. At a minimum, he completely failed to do his job to resolve the issue at customs. That's possible. But at one point, I asked my lawyer if I had come to him, how hard would it have been for him to deal with this? He replied, "Jack Minut, you can solve it in 5 minutes." I said, "Wow, I should have gone to you." So while the incompetence explanation was or is possible, it's never been my first or even second go-to explanation for human behavior. And I felt in my gut that he had collaborated with the authorities to make it happen. He had motive, and the timing of the detention the day before my trip is very difficult to believe that this was coincidental. I am generally skeptical of coincidences, especially in this part of the world. There are other reasons why I believe this, but I'm not at liberty to explain because I could put some people in danger. I would almost certainly never be able to prove his collaboration, and obviously he will never admit it. Nevertheless, I remained president until July 5th, but I immediately experienced a dramatic increase of insubordination of HR office, PR offices, and others that directly reported to the VPCOO, and I was not pleased. Now, the board response was twofold. On the one hand, they were very supportive in using all of their power and contacts to try to influence an outcome that would keep me from going to jail. And I'm very grateful for that. But also, within a few weeks, they were pushing me hard to resign. And at times, the message was conveyed in a rather coercive way, to put it lightly. I was reluctant to resign because, one, I thought it would reduce my leverage and it would make me look guilty. And also, I had a 5-year contract. What if I resign? I mean, I wanted to have some guarantee about some, compensation and a severance package if I did so. So Almost all of my communication with the board at the time was directly with the chair and over the phone. And he said that their sources indicate that it was certain that I would be found guilty and deported. My lawyers were also not optimistic that I would be found innocent, but our goal was to be found guilty of a lesser charge that would incur a fine, $3,000 or $4,000, deportation, but not going to jail. The board chair provided me in writing that my contract would not be prejudiced by what if I resigned. And there were lots of sweet words about generous compensation, facilitating a soft landing, transition to the next phase of life, and the like. So I agreed to resign on June 5th, and I announced it on the online graduation ceremony. Well, that was a decision I came to deeply regret. What finally happened in my court case was I was found innocent of the charges about receiving psychotropic substances with the intent to produce and distribute narcotics. But I would be deported. And the reason for deportation is the AUCA did not renew my work registration in early July because I'd resigned as president. Now, whether the board was aware of the registration issue, I do not know. But I do know that the responsibility to execute this would be at the decision of the VPCOO. So, epilogue and conclusions. Well, as if this was not a sad enough story, upon my return finally to the US in August, I discovered that all the nice words of soft landing, transition, etc., from the board proved to be empty or vague promises. And I find myself having to take my case to arbitration over my severance package. Sometime next year, a judge will decide about this. From a moral standpoint, an ethical standpoint, I find their behavior reprehensible. From a pragmatic standpoint, I find it nonsensical. Since I cannot imagine how they will be able to recruit another competent and reputable president after what has happened to me and their role with it. More broadly, it's highly ironic that in the end, I was treated more fairly and more compassionately by the Kyrgyz legal system and the Kyrgyz government than I was by AUCA. I also find it bizarre that while the board was in such a rush to have me step down, nearly 6 months later, no search has been announced for a new president. There has been no changes within the administration. And those who have behaved badly, and they know who they are, remain in their positions. My main motivation for this talk, however, it's not revenge, although I can tell you in the first 2 months or so, I wanted to see the VPCOO burn in hell. That's pretty strong views about that. It was pretty hard for Lilia to live with me and all the anger that I had about all this. My main motivation for this talk is out of concern for the university. A U.S. judge will resolve my compensation, and the next phase of my career will sort itself out over time. But for the university, the political and economic situation in the country is more unstable. It's more corrupt. Perhaps the corruption is more endemic today even than the past. The domestic political wins against American values are stronger. Anybody following the parliamentary elections that took place last Sunday in Kyrgyzstan, it looks to be kind of a farce. The Electoral Commission was reporting results up to 70% of the vote, and then there was 40 minutes of blackout and no results reported. And then they started reporting, when they started reporting again at 90%, these results were totally different than what they were at 70%. I mean, it's not a good look. Okay, sorry, I don't mean to make light of it, but it's just, come on, guys, this is sad. And unlike other Soros-sponsored institutions of higher learning, like the Central European University that moved a couple of years ago from Budapest to Vienna, or the European Humanitarian University in Minsk, which about 15 years ago moved from Minsk to Vilnius, Lithuania. There's no place for AUCA to go. Um, so despite its warts, in my own personal experience, AUCA is an extraordinarily important institution for Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia, especially including Afghanistan. So I deeply hope that those responsible for oversight of the university will be more careful in the months and years ahead. With the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think U.S. authority in the region is probably at an all-time low in the past 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. There will be no tears shed in Ankara, Beijing, or Moscow if AUCA is sidelined. In my many discussions with early alums of AUCA, the pioneers, when I asked why they chose this new and very small institution, um, the response most often heard was AUCA is not corrupt like all other Kyrgyz universities. Not corrupt. That was more important than the American style liberal arts education, was not corrupt. By the time I arrived, I sensed this unique quality had degraded to some extent, and my main task was to try to restore it to the extent that I could with the help of others. Um, in this veritable sea of corruption. It's an interesting, it's a question, to what extent can an institution which purports to promote the values like an AUCA exist in an environment, broader environment, which is so contrary, where there's so much resistance to that. But with the exception that, you go back to the point I made about Ed Schatz's book, the power of America is an idea. The power of people to want to make see their lives be better, to be more free, to be more just, for things to be more transparent. All those good things that we believe in as core American values. So let's make sure this dream is kept alive. If this remarkable project loses sight of its core mission, it will fail and it will not be worth its name. And I can only hope that the current and future stewards of the university will keep this uttermost in their minds when charting the future of the university. And finally, again, we must live up to our values if we are to have success in democracy promotion in other places. And AUCA needs to seriously adjust some of its practices to live up to its great promise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's an honor for us to have you share it first here in its entirety, but an incredible journey. So
happy to be here and not in a Kyrgyz prison.
Yes, I can imagine. Yeah. As are we all, right? So we probably have a few minutes, right? You open up for some questions? Okay. 15. Okay, good. Any questions here in the room, or shall we turn to Zoom? I have questions. Yes, go ahead and introduce yourself to him if you wouldn't mind.
Hi, my name is Christina Hill. I'm a master's student at Kyrgyz. I actually lived in Almaty, Kazakhstan, and I worked at the student recruitment and admissions office at Kimep University, which obviously has its exactly, and also has like its issues. And yeah, and I think just like your story and everything you were saying, it just sounded so familiar, obviously in a different way. But I wonder, do you think like you will still have like any relationship with the students that you may have interacted at AUCA, or any interaction with perhaps Kyrgyz students in the US, like later on, as you mentioned, like exchange programs are really important? Yes.
Thank you. I certainly hope so. On Wednesday afternoon, Lily and I met with our valedictorian of 2020, Olga Puikova, a wonderful young woman who was working in Washington on an internship as part of the U.S. Central. She was a recipient of a grantee of the U.S. Central Asia Educational Foundation, actually, which supports students at KEMEP and AUCA. I just wrote, I was telling Johanna that I wrote a recommendation for one of our top Afghan students, one of our top students overall, who wants to come here to Greece next year. And I am in contact with a number of students and number of faculty. You know, but over time, well, I can't go back to the country now, and frankly, don't have a big desire to do so. Although, I did suggest to board members, although I knew they were never going to be interested in this, that one good way of resolving this would be to put me on the board of AUCA. Nobody knows what's going on at that university, at least in America, more than I do. And it would also be a tremendous kind of statement of the board about myself, and it would, I think, make it much easier to recruit another president. But I guess the idea makes too much sense.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, do we have some Zoom questions?
We have a couple of Zoom questions, yes. So one question is specifically about how supportive civil society
Oh dear.
And the question comes from Stephen Benson.
Stephen Benson is an old colleague from CSIS, retired naval logistics officer. And we worked a lot together on a project on the Northern Distribution Network in Afghanistan, and also on thinking about a regional economic cooperation strategy for Afghanistan. We called the Modern Silk Road, and the Obama administration kind of, sort of, was interested in it, but not totally. It's my understanding that the representative of the Open Society Foundation on the board is the person most antagonistic to me, which is very surprising because he was the most enthusiastic about me being hired in 2019, and I've known him for 30 years. I can't. This is what I've heard. I have it on reasonably good sources, but I don't know for sure. So that's what I have to say on that.
Yeah. Why don't you introduce yourself, Grace?
Hi, I'm Grace Kyle. I'm also a it's actually
Oh, cool.
working across the other side. I was wondering your thoughts on how to get around the pandemic corruption. It feels like, especially in Kyrgyzstan, that it's almost like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back with democratization and corruption. So I was wondering how you thought that the government and also universities could take steps to reduce that corruption and also to work to consolidate some of the democratic efforts that have happened in the past years or so.
Well, that's a very hard question. From the standpoint of the university, I think it starts with simply, practicing what you preach. Secondly, and we were starting to do this much more. This is something that AUCA had not really been very effective in doing, is reaching out and being in contact with their alumni. But on the other hand, it's extremely important that AUCA not be viewed as political. That we are already viewed as a CIA supported organization, like most American organizations in places that are pretty corrupt and all that. So it's a very tricky line that the institution can fall, and there are super big limitations, I think, on what the institution itself can do. But I think a starting point is how the institution itself operates and behaves, and then to really look to engage and support its alumni, and vice versa. and vice versa. You know, I know when I, if I, the negative data point I would look at is that, you know, this AUCA has been a great success. There are more than 4,500 graduates. Maybe it's up to close to maybe more than that since last year's graduating group, you know, over the last 20 plus years. And okay, has corruption lessened in the country? I'd have to say no. There's not a, so it's a tough problem. I wish, you know, we could get a Nobel Prize if we could figure that one out.
Do you want to go back to Zoom questions? Or okay. Oh, no one can hear the question, so I'll repeat unless you have the right. Okay.
So the next question is coming from Jackie Miller. She said that she taught briefly at KAF back in the late 90s on an IREX fellowship and remembers being very impressed by the students, and is wondering what the reaction of the student body was to your ordeal and whether you have any way for your narrative to reach them.
Thanks, Jackie, old friend, for the question. Well, first of all, I mean, the students were very supportive when this happened. The student body made a very strong statement in my support. That was made public, and in a way, what I'm doing today is a way of not reaching out to a lot of people, including the students of AUCA, to understand what happened. And I want to emphasize that there are the majority of people at the institution, the majority, the great majority, they do want to do the right thing. And they had a lot of hopes when I came that I would be an agent for positive change. And I tried, and well, it didn't work out. So I think I'm afraid that the morale at the university right now is not good, and they also find themselves rudderless without a real leader being there. I mean, there's an interim president, but I think he's only been there one time in the last 6 months. So I feel for the students. You know, the report that we had from our graduate of 2020 we talked with a couple of days ago was pretty grim. So, you know, I wish all the best for the university, and that's why I am doing this. I felt it's the only way, you know, to see positive change. You know, my just being quiet and rolling with the punches. Obviously, that was not going to change anything. I don't expect that by speaking out is going to, you know, be some kind of miracle cure-all, but at least it's something.
Yeah, go ahead. Should we pass the microphone to Alex? Just repeat it. Okay.
Given the difficult operating environment for international organizations and the constraints, the antagonism towards foreign-funded independent media in Kyrgyzstan, what should the U.S. be doing to effectively promote democratic development in Kyrgyzstan?
Okay, the question, great. What can the U.S. government do to promote democracy and better governance in Kyrgyzstan or other places? Well, there are points of light. I mean, the two most successful projects in Central Asia over the last 30 years, one is AUCA. The other is Radio Azatik, the Kyrgyz version of Radio Liberty. And Radio Azatik has remarkable outreach numbers and a large listenership and readership on their website. So I mean, those are and it's very important that there be since Russia media is so dominant in Kyrgyzstan and many other post-Soviet states, that there be an alternative to that narrative. And Azatik, Klub, other things, they provide that. In Kyrgyzstan, for now, that's allowed. Other places, it wouldn't be. So I think there's something to be taken from that lesson. But there are limitations on what you can do in some places, and many places, but they would not allow an AUCA. They would not allow a radioacity to do the kinds of things they're doing. So I think that we need to think in long term. So I've always thought about exchanges and higher education as a strong means. Although, like I said, if you kind of look at what change has happened in this 27 years since the existence of the university, well, there are simply limitations. But there's nothing that the importance of human contact and human interaction, direct person-to-person interaction between Americans and others, it's life-changing for both sides. And I was a student in Moscow in 1981, and I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have, be a so-called Russia Eurasia expert if I didn't do that. And so the whole kind of career track can take a different point. So I think the investments that we make in exchange programs, opportunities for fellowships, and in institutions is critical. And just try to do what we can and try to do it well.
One more question.
Sure.
Okay, and this will maybe be our last online question. So this is from Richard Miles, who says that when he was with the American Embassy in 2015, he spent some time familiarizing himself with the Gulen movement's secondary and college level infrastructure. Even then, the Kyrgyz authorities were under some pressure from the Erdogan government to curtail their control of this infrastructure. How was the situation when you left Kyrgyzstan?
Thank you, Ambassador Miles, for the question. This is a sad story. Mr. Erdogan, 12, 15 years ago, was very close with Fethullah Gulen, who lives in Pennsylvania and has done so much to support higher education in Turkic speaking countries, including Kyrgyzstan. There was a terrible scandal this year, and that the director of the Cambridge School, which initially started as a Gulen school, but sort of their organizational structure changed over time. I think because of the concern about appearing as a Gulen institution. He came to Kyrgyzstan in 1992. He'd been working to support secondary education in Kyrgyzstan for nearly 30 years. They've established schools, good schools, all over the country. Kyrgyzstan allowed him to be extradited to Turkey this year. So that is a very, very negative data point and point of concern. And on that, also this year, Bard College was thrown out of St. Petersburg. The program at the St. Petersburg was the School of Liberal Arts Studies.
We know it well because
know-
we looked at it hard too. Yeah.
And of course, when that happened, the question arose, well, what about AUCA? Because like I said, the other two source institutions in the region. And I would say for AUCA, well, yes, the amount of heat is greater, but I mean, okay, the Bard College operation in St. Petersburg, it's a small piece of a large higher educational system. AUCA is the strongest game in town, although it's degrading, I think, somewhat, and some competition may be catching up. So a decision to close down AUCA would have much greater resonance in the small environment that it is. So at least as of the spring and still to today, I'm relatively optimistic on that point.
Can I ask the last question? This is Michael D. Okay, Andy. So you not only have had this experience, but over the last 30 years, you've been a very serious and influential researcher in this area, and you've written a lot of policy relevant stuff on of course, and on Central Asia and on the post-Soviet region more generally, and Russia in particular. So since we are less than a week away now from the real collapse of the Soviet Union, what's your what would you have said to yourself 30 years ago in that kind of moment of hope from the perspective of now? What do you I guess what's your general perspective on where we have been? And you have 5 minutes.
Well, had a similar discussion about this recently. Someone asked, are you surprised that there have only been 2 leaders in Russia in the last 30 years? Well, if someone had said to me in 1990,
There's the whole chapter.
oops, sorry, little Dima. Okay, 2 1/4. I would have been surprised about that in 1991. I mean, certainly, of course, we were feeling sort of dizzy with success at that time, and it's a Yogi Bear that said predicting the future is hard or something like that. Henry Hale, I thought, wrote a very good piece on the 25-year anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union.
It was from our conference here, just have to mention.
A lot of good things happened here. That the collapse of the Soviet Union was the most de-democratizing event in the 20th century, or something to that effect. And that, I mean, not only looking at Russia or Kyrgyzstan, but just looking across the board at the 12 new states, not the Baltic states. That the record for democracy is it's grim. It is sad. It is part of a larger, I mean, especially in the last 15 years or so, it's part of a larger global trend toward the popularity of authoritarian populist nationalists. But yes, I find it surprising. I have to look at what happened to U.S.-Russia relations. I started joking 5 or 6 years ago. I spent 25, 30 years, most of my adult life, trying to build greater understanding and improve between Russians and Americans and improve relations, and I'm a complete failure. Complete failure. What I would say is that it's a long game. When the Soviet Union collapsed, my feeling was that, for whatever transition takes place, I think it's going to take at least 2 generations. So I was thinking in terms of, 50 years, 40 years. We're 30 years into it. The data points don't look good. Certainly, Vladimir looks that he wants to remain there, well, into perpetuity. But things can change, and we don't know when they're going to change. That was, most people were very surprised about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, ironic for our mentors, who were, we can go back to when we were undergraduate students and graduate students in the 1980s, and the general prediction was that the Soviet Union could muddle along.
Yeah, Tim Colton wrote that.
Yeah, and there were understandable reasons for believing that. Also, our mentors were very aware of all of the problems of the Soviet Union, the dysfunctional economy, the nationalities, ethnic challenges in the place. I remember and others. but it was, everybody understood that an attempt to reform the system entailed huge risk,
Mhm, mhm.
because at the bottom of it was the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was the glue that held everything together. And you take that away, and um, the concern is that it's too risky. It's too risky to do. Who would undertake that? And well, Gorbachev did. He did not succeed. His failure was not inevitable, in my view. He was certainly undermined by the collapse of the economy, which a lot of it was driven by the collapse of the oil price. So I don't care who was in power in the late 1980s. You know, the Soviet Union basically went bankrupt, and so that sort of broader environment was going to be toxic for any leader who tried to reform or didn't try to reform. And there's a dilemma about reform because human nature does not want to change things. It's the way we're built, and our psychology is typically we think in linear terms. But the fact is, these black swan events do occur. But how do you predict them, and how do you prevent them? Uh, that's those are very hard questions to address. Um, so you know,
Never say never.
never say never, and things can change quickly, very quickly, and unexpectedly. I mean, that was the lesson to us when we were your age, and the Berlin Wall went down. I was a graduate student in an MA program at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I was in Bologna in the spring of 1984. Had a conversation with 3 or 4 students from Germany, the FRG, the Federal Republic of Germany, and I said, look, this arrangement where Germany is disunited, it just seems unnatural to me. Is it? Do you think that it can change? Absolutely not, Andy. It cannot change. You don't understand. I said, well, what about in 25 years? No way. You do not understand, Andy. I said, what about in our lifetimes? Honestly, I had this conversation, and these are some of the brightest graduate students in Germany. No way. It was not going to happen. Well, I didn't predict it, but 5 years it happened. And it happened really fast. In the fall of 1989, everything went down like a house of cards. And similar to the Soviet collapse. So we'll see.
Right. Yep. I think that's what we learned after 30 years.
Poživim, uvidím.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Andy. Thank all of you here in the room. Thank you, Jovana and Amir and Chris very much for co-sponsoring with us. And best of luck recovering from all of this. But I know you, and I know you will go on. So thank you for sharing your story here, and thanks those of you online as well. All right.
Thank you.
Wow, you got to write it down, man.